Anthropological period. Anthropological period from the word anthropos, or human being. The questions which the cosmological period was concerned with did not get clear answers, and essentially, you may say, people said, "Oh, to hell with it then." What do we actually care about? Do we care about how the universe works? Not so much. What we care about is how should we live our life, and that's what this period is essentially concerned with. The human-centered issues, the issues of how do we conduct, how do we do things on a daily basis, what is our life for? We can again distinguish there the Sophists and the Socrates, and we'll talk about both of them today. The book has them as two separate chapters. I think that we can cover them in one go. Nonetheless, they obviously had a different approach to that. First came the Sophists, then as kind of a response to them, you may say, came Socrates, and they kind of both are playing off each other in a sense. So, the period in general was considered Golden Age of Greece. By the 5th century BC, Athens becomes commercial, intellectual, artistic center of Greek culture. This period is rich with advances in medicine, architecture, art, poetry, drama. One of the best dramas written, Euripides and so on. The great works of art, you can still see some of them in best museums in Europe. The birth of Athenian democracy. The democracy was born, the new form of government. Golden Age. Golden Age, but in the same time, moral disintegration. Moral and cultural malice slowly kicks in throughout this period. Part of the reason eventually was the Peloponnesian War, and this is what Thucydides said about it in his History of Peloponnesian War. He was saying, "The common meaning of words was turned about at men's pleasure. The most reckless bravado was deemed the most desirable friend. A man of prudence and moderation was styled a coward. A man who listened to reason was good-for-nothing simpleton." So what he is trying to say is that people were cynical. They wanted to advance, and they did not care how they get ahead, what would they use to get ahead. There were 4 major courses of this disintegration, as scholars now agree more or less about. So the first one, respect for cultural authorities. These poets, the poetic tradition, declined. Remember, we were talking about it throughout, like people started questioning all that. There's multiple gods, the heroic, the hero athlete who is fighting at war, fighting for his honor and so on. That was considered an ideal, and people started questioning that too, and philosophers helped, because remember, Xenophonus was like questioning all that, and of course many people read that and they were thinking, yes indeed, what's this Homeric ideal? Why should we even follow that? But there was nothing to replace that. So basically it resulted in a loss of the metaphysical foundation. The second reason, increased contacts with different cultures, customs, and laws. People started traveling more. There was a lot of travel. People would go to these other lands and see people there live different life, different lifestyle. So then naturally, like one of the two reactions you can have. You can say, the way we live, the Greek people, is the best one. And all these people are just being stupid. They don't know any better. But the other way to look at it is, well, maybe they are right in their own way. Maybe their culture even in some ways better than ours, right? And you can start...
but that's how they invented like the word barbarians.
Yeah, the barbarians, that's one, like, I guess the first approach would be to call everybody else a barbarian. Those stupid people. They don't know any better. But still, you can't help but wondering about, maybe it's all relative. Maybe what is good for one culture is good for this culture, and what is good for us is actually good for us. Maybe there is no one set way to live in this life. For example, if you take Spartans, I don't know if you guys are aware of that, but they had this apparently tradition that they would look at their newly born babies, and the ones which they didn't think are strong enough, they would take them away, and they would just leave them to die. They were not strangling them or anything, but they, with a baby you don't need much to have him die. And they thought that was perfectly fine. That they thought that's the way you should do things. So then the question naturally is it the way to do things or not? Like, maybe you can say, well, for Spartans it is, and for Athenians it is not. Or maybe you can say, no, it's actually wrong way to do it for everybody. But then the question is, like, who says so? So anyway, that was one of the other reasons why morality was disintegrating. The third reason, you can say, democratic lawmaking. We all know how democracy works, right? Certain people become politicians, they get the votes, and then what happens? Then everybody blames them and says that they only care about themselves, they are lying to us constantly. What does it do to the authority, to the figure of authority? You no longer respect them, right? We can see it in our own country too. People start wondering, like, well, all these idiots, they have been elected to run this country, but they seem to know even less than we do. So naturally, how would you respect the authority? You would not respect the authority. How would you respect the laws of the country? You also will question the laws. You would say, well, these people passed those laws, but they don't know any better. I know better than them. So that's another thing which was happening, and that, unfortunately, again, comes with democracy. Every time you have a democracy, you have this kind of a problem. And finally, the plurality of opinions among the philosophers, just like we established, and scientists concerning the nature of reality, led to skeptical conclusion that no one can ever know the truth. They all disagree. They all have these scientific methods. And remember that science really has all these advances in the last few hundred years. For thousands of years, there were people who were doing these scientific experiments, but they were not really getting very much out of it. So there was always this attitude, especially at that time, it's like they're wasting their time. What are they doing? They're looking at the stars. Fine, he predicted the solar eclipse. Big deal, boo-hoo, who cares? Right? Do we even care when the solar eclipse is going to happen? That's none of our concern. So that was how people started looking at science, among other things. Like, it's some sort of pointless occupation which these idiots are engaged in, and they think they're smarter than us, but they actually are not. And we can even see it today. Many people look at it this way, like they all think they're experts. What makes them experts? There's no experts. I'm just as much an expert as they are. I may be a taxi driver, but I know better. If I only had a chance, I could run the country better and do everything better. Anyway, and just like today, that was happening back then, and as a result, people started to become more cynical, and the practical approach emerged. Loss of interest in all these metaphysical questions. They were not really wondering anymore about gods and so on. What did they care about? They cared about how to serve their own personal interests. How to achieve something in life in sense of money, prestige, tangible things. The tangible things which you can achieve. That was important. And this is where the Sophists kind of step in. The word sophist is derived from the Greek word sophia, or wisdom. Originally, sophos or sophistes, as they were known, was kind of a neutral word. It meant something like a professor. So basically a knowledgeable person who can teach you things, right? And this is what they were doing. The disrepute of the Sophists only happened after Socrates and after this entire thing, which we'll talk about today, when some people became kind of suspicious about what they are doing. So they offered guidance in practical matters to the rising class of politicians. People who wanted to achieve something, and they were proclaiming themselves as teaching what is known as arete. Arete is the Greek word which we'll come back to next class again. Basically, it's translated usually as virtue, but whether it's virtue, it's not necessarily virtue the way we think about it in English language. It's more of this knowledge of right way to live. We will talk more about this word next time. So they were teaching how to live the right way. And more specifically, rhetoric, debate, public speaking, and persuasion. Why? Well, because first of all, in democratic society, lots of questions were decided by the popular vote. If you wanted to be a politician, if you wanted to achieve something, you needed to convince other people. So it's kind of a combination what today at CSN we may say Philosophy 102 class teaches Psychology 101 and Communications 101. In other words, how do you speak to people? How do you convince them to do what you want them to do, which involves some psychology, obviously. And how do you structure your speeches so they would make sense, like using logic, the proper layout of an argument. How do you specifically tell people things so that they would accept your point of view? The result, of course, being you achieve what you want to achieve. If you want to run for office, you are elected. If you want people to do certain things which you want them to do, you convince them to do that, be it a large crowd or one person. Language plays a big part of it, and it was mostly revolving around linguistics, although the Sophists themselves looked at a variety of issues. Like I said, they were kind of like professors. In fact, some scholars today suggest that perhaps because of this entire quarrel with Socrates, we tend to look at them very negatively, when in fact we should appreciate some of their points of view in a little more neutral way. Well, be it as it may, let's look at several major figures and what they were teaching. This is, I think, chapter 3, right? So chapter 3 is on this, and homework is on Protagoras. So Protagoras was one of the main well-known sophists. He was born somewhere around 490 BC, died around 420 BC, 21 years before the trial of Socrates, which we will talk about later. But he may have met Socrates. In fact, there is Plato's dialogue called Protagoras, where Socrates is supposedly talking to Protagoras. Whether it really took place, we don't know. Nonetheless, it's quite possible. Some of the things he was teaching, this is one of the quotes: "Concerning the gods, I am unable to discover whether they exist or not, or what they are like in form. For there are many hindrances to knowledge, the obscurity of the subject, and brevity of human life." So this is something we already heard. It's kind of like this more or less skeptical view of the gods. In other words, saying, well, maybe there are gods, I just don't know what they are. Sounds rather reasonable. He's more well known for another saying, which became a little bit of controversial, again, because of the way Plato describes it. Man is the measure of all things. That's a famous saying of Protagoras. The full quote supposedly is, "Man is the measure of all things, of those that they are, and of those that are not, that they are not." Now, what exactly does he mean here? The way Plato portrays it in a dialogue is like this. What is good for me may be bad for you, and what is bad for you may be good for me. So, in other words, each man individually is the measure, right? So, if you look at it this way, it's basically saying that, each one of us decides what is the best for themselves. There's no common good. Of course, you may look at it the other way, and some scholars are saying that Plato is actually distorting it somewhat. What Protagoras meant is a little bit different. What he probably meant is all men as society are the measure of things. Not that it is very different than to say each one of us is the measure. So we as human beings together decide what is good and what is bad. So just because I think something is good doesn't necessarily measure up to this unless other human beings agree with me. And I have to have at least majority of them to agree with me in order for it to truly be good. Note that it still is kind of relative in the sense that it's saying there's no such thing as good as the Bible says, which is good for everybody regardless whether you agree or not. Nonetheless, it's not saying that each one of us can personally decide what is good. Which one of these meanings you take is obviously up to you, because we don't have actual writings of Protagoras defending it. Like I said, it's mentioned in Plato. Plato describes it in this way, but it may not be exactly how Protagoras himself looked at it. Gorgias, that's another one of the famous Sophists which we should mention. He was a teacher of rhetoric, so he specifically taught how to make speeches. And again, there is a Plato's dialogue called Gorgias, where Gorgias is supposedly talking to Socrates. He lived in somewhere in the period of 485 to 375. We don't know exactly when. Note it's 110 years. Unlikely he lived the entire 110, but somewhere there. He had this free thesis which we know now. It's from his work written at the time. So kind of, if you remember Parmenides, that's kind of a little bit related to what Parmenides was saying. And so he was saying, first of all, nothing exists. His first thesis was nothing exists. And the way he was defending it was, well, if being is eternal, then it is unlimited, right? But if it is unlimited, it's nowhere. Because where would you place something which is unlimited? It's not placed in any particular place. So based on that, you can say that there's actually nothing. Nothing exists. You may say it's all an illusion. The second thesis he was saying, if anything does exist, it's unknowable. And the way he defended that was, well, the subject of thought is not being. The subject of thought is thought. And note that it is fundamentally different from being. So again, it's this kind of skeptical question which comes back to us over and over again throughout the entire history of philosophy. How do we know things really exist? So his answer was, we don't. We really don't. All we have access for is what's in our head, but there's no objects in our head. And the objects which are out there in the real world, we really don't know whether they are there or not. And finally, his third thesis was, well, if it is knowable, it cannot be communicated. Because when we communicate with each other, we use words, right? But words is not substance. So you can say whatever you want to another person, but that's not going to communicate real knowledge. You can only personally maybe obtain it somehow, but you cannot give it to other people. So if they don't have it, they don't have it. Communication itself is not means to transfer this kind of knowledge. So rather skeptical approach. That's how he looked at it. An interesting debate at the time, which also kind of related closely to the Sophists, was the distinction between Phusis and Nomos. What does it mean? Those are Greek words. The word Phusis means, is commonly translated as nature, right? Refers to features of the world that are independent of human traditions and decisions. Well, such as the law of gravity, for example. This is, by the way, where our word physics came from, the Phusis. We study things which are independent of us. Nomos, on the other hand, is based on human customs or convention. So you can say that certain things are Phusis and certain things are Nomos. Certain laws are laws of Phusis and certain laws are laws of Nomos. Right? So based on that, again, Sophists agreed that traditional morality based on Nomos. All morality is Nomos. Note that again, this is what Protagoras was probably saying, by man as the measure of things. So when we think that, for example, leaving those babies to die is wrong, why do we think that? Well, we think that because as human beings, we decided that this is not a good idea. There is no such thing, written in the whatever great book of the world, which would make it Phusis, as for example the law of gravity. There's no such thing. But as human beings, we just agreed to do that. And since we agreed to do that, this is how we do things. Of course, that changes a lot, and note that it also kind of opens the door to this kind of cynical approach again to say, well, okay, everybody agreed on that, that's very nice, but why should I personally follow that? Because the way religion, for example, explains it, well, when you die, there will be a judgment, right? And you will have to respond. But if there's no judgment, if there's nothing to respond, what natural reaction that may cause in you? You may say, well, perhaps, I should just pretend, right? When others can see me. And this is what Antiphon, another famous sophist, was specifically saying. This is the quote. He's saying, "A man will be just then, in a way most advantageous to himself, if in the presence of witnesses he holds the laws of the city, or nomoi, in high esteem, and in the absence of witnesses, when he is alone, those of nature, Phusis." So what he's saying is very plainly like pretend, right? When others can see you, of course you have to follow their laws, because otherwise they'll punish you. Or at least they will not be happy with you. But if they cannot see you, if you can get away with it, then do whatever you want. Because in the end of the day, the only thing which matters, are you happy? And that will make you happy. So that is essentially, again, this kind of cynical approach which we will see Socrates and Plato reacted against. Let's take a little poll. We actually have a poll feature. And this is an interesting question also related to all this. Because it's been going on for a long time, but there are three major approaches to how we see society's progress, whether there is any progress. So the first approach, which they also had at the time, is a golden age myth. The golden age myth is to say, well, the best times are behind us. It's in the past. It used to be better, but it's getting worse and worse and worse. Society is deteriorating all the time. The second way, remember the Pythagoreans had it, is eternal recurrence. Eternal recurrence, essentially saying, well, it's always like back and forth. It gets better, then it gets worse, it gets better, it gets worse, and it's all like revolving around and repeating itself. And finally, the third way is to say there is actually progress. We're actually getting somewhere. Things are improving throughout human history, and we may eventually get to some very, very good state. So let's start this poll. Now let me see what you guys think. So A, B, C. A, the first one, B, the second one, and C, the third one. Let's all vote and see where we stand on that issue. Give you a few minutes, but not too long, because we don't want to take half of the class waiting. Okay, we're done. Let's see what we got. So one person actually thinks the golden age myth is how things are. And the better times are behind us, and it's getting worse and worse. Majority, although not overwhelming majority, thinks that it's all eternal recurrence. It gets over and over again and comes back. And finally, 38%, roughly one-third, thinks that we do have progress. We are getting somewhere. Okay, well, you can feel free to elaborate on that, guys, if you want to say something. Defend your point of view.
I chose C, but I also believe, okay, it's human nature to go back to our instincts because we still have instincts, and there are, wars get repeated over and over again because of land or power, money, but I feel like with every single time the cycle repeats, something like we make progress, whether technology, economically, we as people. So yeah, I think that even though we're stuck in like a loop, the loop, like we keep progressing, like we as like humans, like just get better and better despite going back to our instincts.
So it's kind of like a spiral. We are circling, but we are getting higher and higher. Okay, well, you see, lots of people are saying that it's not really getting better because you can obviously see technology is getting better. But there's still a question whether human beings are getting better because of the technology getting better. And whether, in the end of the day, we are happier. Because there's a huge debate about what constitutes human happiness, and a lot of people would agree that it's not material things, right? Whether we are getting better at other things, that's a big question, because materially, yeah, of course. I mean, when I grew up, there were no iPhones, right? I would get a book, but one may argue I was happier to get a new book than people today getting a new iPhone. So it is a lot more sophisticated in technological sense, but whether it makes you happier, that's a big question. Of course, well, technology did give us a lot of things which are certainly useful, such as more food, better shelter, we don't live in caves anymore, and so on. And it's hard to argue that it doesn't matter in that sense, because, you know, if you live in a cave and the bison or whoever can come and like kill you, and you cold all the time, and you die when you are like 30 years old because there's no medicine, it's probably not a very happy living. I would think that at least in that sense we did get somewhere. At least a little bit. So yeah, anyway, but that's an eternal debate on the subject. And that brings us to Socrates. So this is historical depiction. He looked kind of like that as far as we know. He had the snub nose and bulging eyes, wasn't a particularly pretty by Greek standards, lived somewhere between 469 399. 469, some experts are saying maybe it was 470 when he was born, 469. We don't know the exact date, but approximate date. But he definitely died in 399, we know that much, because this is when he was, spoiler alert, if you didn't read the reading yet, when he was sentenced to death and executed. He was, as you can see, 70 years old.
Wait, was he the one that drank poison, or was that Aristotle?
Oh, come on, did you not do the reading at all?
I did. I remember he was executed. He had
Yes,
like a
he
wife
drank
and
poison.
kids.
We will talk about it today.
I don't remember if they specifically said like poison or not, and like he was like encouraged to kill himself. Like he was like, I mean, then like people said like, oh, go away, run away, you know, escape, and he's like, nah, I'm gonna do it.
Yes. So, okay, let's talk about him a little more. Because, well, one thing we should immediately mention, the famous Socratic Problem. What is the Socratic Problem? Socratic Problem is basically, who really was Socrates? There's a lot of information we get about him from Plato. In fact, Plato is the major source of information. 20 of his dialogues talk about Socrates. However, Socrates himself never wrote anything. We don't have his original work. So whatever we know about him comes from mainly Plato and a couple of other sources. Can we trust that? Does it actually tell us the truth about Socrates? Well, that is a difficult question in philosophy, because again, when you rely on something like this happening 2,400 years ago, you are bound to have problems. However, we do kind of have an answer. And an answer is this, while we don't know exactly, but we do believe that the early dialogues by Plato do describe more or less accurately historic Socrates the way he was. Whereas when you move on with the way Plato describes him, then Plato starts basically fantasizing and making things up, and essentially describing his own philosophy rather than the philosophy of Socrates. And one of the sources we know about it is actually Aristotle. Aristotle mentions it. We will have a reading from Aristotle not next week, the week after that. And I think it may be in that reading too. He was saying that Socrates himself was not, he didn't have this kind of sophisticated system. He was a very simple person. All he was wondering about is ethical questions, the questions of morality. He was never coming up with these sophisticated explanations as Plato will eventually. And early dialogues. And how do we know which ones are early? That's another good question. Well, for one thing, the style changes, and we know the style changes. The way Plato wrote at the beginning is different from his so-called middle period, and it's still different from the late ones. The other one, we can actually do some sort of sophisticated analysis now with computers and try to see the certain words. You know, that when a person grows up, he writes differently. So they kind of calculated how many words and which words are used in each one dialogue, and they were able to again come up with the answers, which some of them were probably written when Plato was still younger, and those are some of the early dialogues, and some of them are later. So the one which you guys were supposed to read for today, the Apology, is one of the early ones, if not the first one. So it probably describes Socrates rather accurately the way he really was. And then the one we will read next week is kind of also one of the early ones, the first book of the Republic, where again he describes Socrates more or less accurately, but the Republic itself, he wrote it probably for many years, and eventually it gives like the whole sophisticated system as Plato himself was imagining it, and it no longer has anything to do with Socrates. Socrates would never come up with this stuff. He was not that kind of a philosopher as Plato was. Again, Plato was his student. Plato was one of the young people who followed him around. When Socrates was executed, Plato was 27. So he was not an old man yet, but he was not that young. However, he lived also a fairly long life, and later on he had his own students, and Aristotle was one of his students in the future, already after the death of Plato, of Socrates. So this is more or less how they are related to each other. Socrates was the teacher of Plato, Plato was the teacher of Aristotle. Okay, now hopefully you did the reading, so let's do a couple of extra credit questions, see if you can get the extra credit here. What was Socrates accused of? Can you give me like the full formal charge? Because it's actually in the reading. Just to give you a hint, there's actually 3 parts of it. False teaching. No, that sounds a little too vague. What's false teaching? False, how false? There is a formal charge. It actually, the reading mentions it because he himself, corrupting the youth, studying the skies. Well, it's not in a formal charge. Corrupting the youth is correct. Not believing in gods which the city believes in. There's a third part to it, and it's not studying the skies. Give me the third part. The third part is what he was making up gods. He was not believing in gods which the city believes in, which is a crime, and making up his own gods. That's a whole other crime. Corrupting, so 3 parts. Corrupting the youth, not believing in gods which the city believes in, and making up his own gods. Okay, how and why did Socrates become a philosopher? He actually describes it again in the reading. He talks about a particular incident. So, can you tell me what it was? What happened? He was living peacefully, and then he became a philosopher. Why? What possessed him? He was said to be a wise man by some deity, by oracle, yes. He went to disprove that case. Exactly. So we will talk about it a little bit more now, but I will give Lisa another extra credit for this. So yes, this is what happened. The oracle said that he was the wisest man, and he was really surprised about this. Anyway, so the subject of the entire thing is the trial of Socrates, which it's a historical event. It definitely took place. We know it from different sources in 399 BC, or if you do the calculation, 2,419 years ago. Jury of 500 people. Note that they had very large juries by our standards. It wasn't 12 people. The way their trials were going, they could have different number of juries depending on the subject, from 200 all the way to 5,000. Believe it or not, They could even have a jury of 5,000 people if the subject was very important. So in his case, it was 500 people, and they were gathering in kind of like a large theater-like auditorium to decide. First, the accusers were bringing their case. And again, the way it worked there was very different from the way it works today in our court system. In Athens, anybody could bring a charge against anybody and be a prosecutor, him or herself. What they needed to do is to file the formal charge. Once they filed this formal charge with an akron, the date would be set for the trial. So then they can present their case again themselves. There was no public prosecutor. They themselves would present their case. The trick now is this: if they get more than 1/5 of the votes in their favor, so for example in case of 500 jury, if less than 100 people would vote to convict, then they would have to pay a very large fine. So that was meant, of course, to discourage people from bringing, unsubstantiated charges. You can also see how it was important to be a good speaker, right? Because the whole thing is there were very few pieces of evidence. Whoever is a prosecutor comes and tells whatever he feels like he has to say, and he tries to convince these 500 people. And then the defender gives his speech, his answer to this, and they have to defend themselves. And then they take a vote. And if the majority agrees with the charge, then they actually move on to the second stage, which is sentencing. And that's another interesting part here, because sentencing was going like this. The person who accuses suggests his idea of a punishment, which in case of Socrates was what? Death. Death. That was what his prosecutors suggested. Meletus, which is the main figure there, a poet Meletus, and he had two others helping him out, kind of co-prosecuting the case. Again, just regular folks, not some sort of special prosecutors. So they requested death. The accused could have suggested his own idea of a punishment. He had a right to suggest alternative punishment. So then they take a vote for this. Well, we'll come back to it in a second. So the formal charge was again, Socrates is guilty of corrupting the youth and of believing not in the gods whom the state believes in, but in other new divinities. He immediately talks about old accusers and new accusers. What does he mean? Who did the reading? Who can answer that? Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't the old accusers people that they were older than him and they had like new ideologies and they're like, oh, you're corrupting the youth, while the new accusers were the young people who are like, oh, well, what he's teaching isn't right because my peers are now like agreeing with him, like with the corrupt version. I don't really remember, but I think that's what it was about.
No, that's not it. Good effort, but what he means by old accusers is he means generally people who dislike him, right? He's been disliked for a long time, and the reason is what he was doing. What he was doing, he was wandering around the Athens and basically bugging people, asking them questions. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but that was the essence of annoyance. So old accusers are all these people who are annoyed with him, which possibly was majority of the population of Athens, majority of its citizens. New accusers, those are the three people who actually brought the charges. So note that they are, of course, different. In age, I don't know if there's any difference. It's possible that old accusers are even younger than new accusers. I don't know. Nobody knows. We don't know the age of the people who are, accusing him. So that's not about age. It's about the fact that there's been accusations before, but now there are formal accusations from these three people. And that's the distinction between them. So first he addresses the old accusers and he's saying, well, regardless of this stuff, why are you people annoyed with me? Why majority of Athenians, or at least large number of Athenians, annoyed with me? And this is when he talks about how it all began. So how it all began is his friend went to Oracle of Delphi, and this is like this oracle. If you saw 300, you probably know, because the movie 300, they kind of portray this oracle there, sitting there on a mountain, and you can go and ask any type of question you want. So he asked Oracle, who is the wisest? And the Oracle said, the Socrates is the wisest. There's nobody wiser than the Socrates. So the way Socrates himself is saying, he was shocked. He was like, I don't know anything. How am I the wisest? That can't be. That cannot be right. How can I be the wisest? So he said, I decided to prove Oracle wrong. I decided to go and to ask people, wise people, people who know things, and to see that they know more than me. So first I approached the politicians, and I started asking them questions about politics and so on. And it turned out they don't know anything. It turned out that they themselves don't know anything. Then I went to the poets, and I tried to ask them, thinking maybe they know things. And it turned out no, they don't know anything either. So he said, then I went to these professional people, people who have expertise. And it turned out that they are even worse, because they know things in their field of expertise. For example, shoemakers know how to make shoes, and that makes them think that they are smart in other subjects. But they are not. They are just as ignorant as everybody else. And then he said, I finally realized that the oracle is right. They don't know anything, and they don't even know that they don't know anything. I don't know anything, and at least I know this much, that I don't know anything. So I guess I must be wiser. So that's basically how he described it. That's you. Anyway, yeah, so that is exactly what he says happened. Of course, he is a little bit disingenuous about that, because he obviously, it's not the whole story. He obviously had another agenda there while he was bugging these people. But you can also see why the old accusers were accusing him. Who would like that? Imagine the guy wandering around the city, and he had a large following of these young people. Plato was one of them, by the way. Large people from wealthy households who just enjoyed the show. So they would walk behind him. He would approach important people. Not, mind you, just some nobodies. Important people of the city. And basically what he was doing is he was pretending to be ignorant indeed, and he would ask them questions like, oh dear sir, you are so smart, and I'm like poor nobody, I don't know anything. You are a judge, for example, right? Explain to me what justice is. And of course they would be like, oh, that's simple. Justice is whatever. And he'd be like, wow, that is such a good answer. That is wonderful answer. But there's just one thing I still don't understand. Can you clarify that? And then he would continue this until they would run into some sort of contradiction. They would suddenly realize that they don't actually know what the hell they're talking about. So eventually that would, what it would usually end is they would get annoyed at him and just run away. And he kept on doing this. So now you hopefully can see why the people were not very happy. Because naturally that's not the kind of behavior which will end well. But this is what was happening. He called himself a gadfly. And he was saying, this is part of the speech again, that's in the reading if you did it. He's saying, Athenians, I hold you in the highest regard and affection, but I will be persuaded by God rather than you. As long as I have breath and strength, I will not give up philosophy, and exhorting you, and declaring the truth to every one of you whom I meet, saying as I am accustomed, my good friend, are you not ashamed of caring so much for the making of money, and for fame and prestige, when you neither care about wisdom and truth and improvement of your soul? So that's the idea there. Note that of course it's not just saying that he doesn't know anything, but he was basically saying that he doesn't know what the truth is, but he believes there is such thing as the truth. And he believes that it's not money. and it's not prestige, and it's not fame. So there is something more tangible than this. That was basically the idea there, and this is how he was different from all these sophists. And of course, it did not end well. So yeah, again, the first vote we know was 280 to 220. 280 voted to consider him guilty. He was like, wow, I actually thought it will be worse than that. But yeah, fair enough. So then, second part was they were actually supposed to vote for the punishment, right? And again, that's a separate vote. And the suggestion of his accusers was that he supposed to be put to death by drinking poison. By the way, another extra credit question. What did he suggest? Because he had to suggest alternative punishment. Well, he eventually settles on the fine. Like, he first suggests something other than the fine. Then he says, okay, but if you, yeah, whatever, I guess I can maybe... Free food, yeah. That's the correct answer. Right, good job, Lisa. Another extra credit for you. He's saying free meals at the Praetorium, which is where the Olympian people who won the Olympic Games were getting it as a reward. So his idea of his punishment was that he should be treated to the free meals. People got so annoyed about it that they actually, when they voted for the death penalty, there were more votes for the death penalty than there were votes to convict him in the first place. And note that actually that was also, well, like the reason why they're giving these two punishments is you can actually suggest something milder, and a lot of people were saying that if he chose to leave the city, they actually would be fine about that, because they were just annoyed about him, right? They didn't want to kill him, but they wanted to get rid of him. So if he suggested exile, that would be okay, and they would agree to that. But naturally, when he suggested, first he suggested free meals, and then he said, okay, fine, I don't have any money, but his students, including, I don't think Plato wasn't there, but his students did say that they can give money, because some of them were rather wealthy. And he said, okay, money, whatever. But it wasn't about money. They just wanted to shut him up, and that wasn't helping. So they voted to kill him, and they did. So this is the famous painting by Jacques-Louis David. Of course, Jacques-Louis David lived many centuries later. He wasn't present there, but this is how he saw it. And this is more or less how we can imagine Socrates here sitting, pointing to the sky, mind you, to God and to the truth, and taking this hemlock poison. This is his students here, all horrified. Even the guy who's giving him poison knows that he's kind of, oh my God, what am I doing here? Yes, they did in another dialogue, they talk about how they suggested that he escape. And they also saying there are some evidence that if he wanted to escape, he could have. They didn't want to kill him. If he escaped and ran into another city, they'd be okay with it. He did not want to escape. He said, no, I will actually stay and die. And so he did. Plato was really impressed about that. It's one of the reasons probably why Plato went and started writing his dialogues, because it was his favorite teacher. He loved him dearly, and he really believed that he was wanted to teach people good things, and then he got murdered. So naturally, Plato was not happy about this whole thing. And his other students were not very happy either. Now, Socrates' task, we can say, was exposing ignorance. He was worried that people of Athens, under the influence of the Sophists, were mistaking false images and shadows for reality. And he thought ignorance is a disease of the soul. You should seek the truth. He thought there is the truth, and we should seek the truth. He called himself midwife of ideas. What did he mean by that? Did you get that? In the reading, he's saying, I am a midwife of ideas. So what exactly does he mean by this? Anybody? What does midwife generally do? How about that?
Catch the baby.
Well, I don't know. The baby doesn't fall like a ball. It actually helps to pull it out, right? But yeah, so this is the idea, right? He does not give you the truth. The truth is already within you. So that's the idea. You have the truth. You just have to find it within yourself, and he helps you out. That's it. Which is also why he says he doesn't know anything. Because he's saying, I don't know the truth myself, but I know there is the truth, and I know that I can help you guys, and we should find it. This is the goal. We should find it. This is how this whole innate ideas part of philosophy, we can say, began. The rationalist theory of knowledge, that there is a truth and the truth is within, and we can find it within us. We'll see in Plato how Plato developed it. Plato developed it very interestingly and quite a bit further than Socrates probably ever thought about, because Socrates indeed did not fantasize about any of that any more than we see from these early dialogues, and there he just says he is ignorant himself. He says he doesn't really know it himself. But there must be something higher. There must be something better. Okay, so what do you think he means? Is there a truth? What is it? Is it worth dying for? Okay, let's take another poll, by the way. Let's do the poll. Is there a truth or not? Yes or no? Vote on whether there is truth. Is there such thing? Or maybe there's no truth. It's just opinions. Everybody has an opinion, right? I think it's black, you think it's white. We're both right in our own way. Anyway, let's finish it up. So out of the people who voted, majority of you do agree that there is truth. Okay, fair enough. So what is it then? Is it worth dying for? Yes.
For me, my truth, because, okay, so I'm Orthodox Christian, and for Christians there is a truth. But the thing is, I wasn't always a Christian. I was atheist for my whole life, and I turned Christian like last year. So I have the idea of both sides, but I'll tell you like mine right now. Because for Christians, the truth is what the Bible writes and what God says is the truth. Would I die for my faith? It's a tricky thing, because one reason is like, of course, because I believe in it, and even if I die, I will like join God in heaven. But then there was also the human side of like, I don't want to die. I still want to live here.
Yeah, what if I'm wrong about this? I don't want to take chances.
like what if not if I'm wrong, but what if it's all just a huge misunderstanding, not Christianity-wise, but like someone thinks that I was offending them, and then I got killed because I'm just me. Like, I believe in something and I get killed for that. That's not really fair. But then again, Christians used to get killed for their beliefs, but then other religions would also get killed for their beliefs. So in terms of like religion, it's a very it's an actual issue, like an actual thing to think about.
Yeah, okay, well, fair enough. That's how many people look at it too. Yeah, indeed, because people can say, I would die for the truth, but I mean, how am I sure this is the truth? Even if you say believe in God, well, God personally is not going to come to you and ask you to die, right? And then what if you're wrong about the particular question and you think that this is the truth, but it turns out that it's not? That doesn't even mean that there is no God. It just means you as a human being could simply make a mistake, right? And so based on that, of course, many people are hesitant to go as far as dying, but they do agree that theoretically there is something which is the truth and worth dying for. But some people say there isn't. And note that, again, this is the big disagreement. Because if you look at the Sophists, obviously they would say that there's no such thing. First of all, there's probably no afterlife, and there's certainly nothing worth dying for. Because that defeats the purpose. The purpose is for us to be happy. How are we going to be happy if we're dead? That's pretty difficult. So naturally, there's nothing to worth dying for. They may even agree that there's certain truth overall, but that truth is not worth dying for. And other people would say, oh, there's no truth to begin with. There's no such thing. It's just my opinion, your opinion, whatever opinion, right? There may be true that, the volcano is erupting, but that's kind of not the kind of truth we are talking about, because in this case we're talking about convictions and the good and the bad and so on. Okay, let's see what Katrina is saying. I feel like death shouldn't be the ultimatum because everybody's version of truth is different, and my truth may be different from yours, but I'm not gonna kill you for it. Yeah, like I said, that's basically along the lines how many people are looking for it. Okay, so Socratic method, the famous Socratic method, again called dialectic method, that's what he was doing, that we already mentioned that. It's kind of a questioning when you, teachers sometimes do it too today, it's called Socratic method, a conversation. You basically ask somebody questions and you kind of lead them towards understanding that they have a problem. A lot of people think they know something, and then what Socrates would do, he would ask them, okay, so you think you know this? Explain to me then. And people start explaining and he would lead on. Our next week's dialogue would be just about that, so please make sure you do the reading. It is quite interesting. He talks about justice. What is justice? And it's a very relevant issue, right? So he specifically does this. This is the dialectic method, first book of the Republic, where he is asking, having conversation with this other guy about justice and what is justice and whether or not we understand what it is. In the end of the day, typical early Socratic dialogue end in what is known as aporia. Aporia is basically dead end. So essentially there's nothing found. It's just found that we don't know. This is probably how most of the actual Socratic dialogues ended. Then later on, the way Plato would be doing it, he will actually move on. And the Republic is a fairly large work where he moves on from this early part and gives his own explanation of what justice is and in general what good is. And so the second lecture we'll have on Wednesday will talk about the way Plato describes it, the way Plato answers this question which Socrates himself only posed. Socrates himself only asked, and he said, I'm sure there is something like that. What is it? Whereas Plato tried to answer that and give a complete answer of what it is. And you will see how he also thinks that we should live according to this principle. Basically, the Socratic method, again, the 6 steps is meeting somebody on the street, isolating the key term. There are a variety of the key terms they talk about in this early dialogue, trying to give a definition. Justice is one of them. Virtue is another. They talk about virtue in another dialogue. There's a number of this kind of courage, what is courage, and so on. Asking, for example, people who are in the military, what is courage? And then they give him an answer, and it turns out that it's not exactly an adequate answer. This is how they would progress, and eventually what happens is, of course, they will get annoyed. The famous Socratic irony is communication on 2 levels, which is happening here. Literal level and the hidden level, right? Socrates continuously praises their wisdom, vast knowledge, but does he really mean that? Probably not. Of course, it is ironic in a sense that what he means to show is that they don't have knowledge and they don't have wisdom. Even though, again, he says that he doesn't either. But he says that theoretically we can get there. And this is the point, right? This is what philosophy is about. To try to get to this knowledge, to try to get to this wisdom. It's not just so that we could buy a bigger car or become a politician and, have people under our control. It's about how to live our life so that we could become better human beings and essentially happier, because happiness is part of it. But the question there is, what makes us happy? Is this the bigger car or is this some other things? And it is just as relevant today as it was relevant back then. So let's see how they were trying to answer it Maybe it will help us to understand how to live our lives. Or maybe not. But let's see, because there were a lot of interesting conversations on that subject throughout all this time. This is a quote from another dialogue, which kind of gives you an idea how people in Athens portrayed it. They are calling him a stingray. They were saying anyone who is close to Socrates and enters into conversation with him is liable to be drawn into an argument. And whatever subject he may start, he will be continually carried round and round by him until at last he finds that he has to give an account both of his present and past life. And when he is once entangled, Socrates will not let him go until he has completely and thoroughly sifted him. You can see how people would not be happy about that. Certainly doesn't sound like fun exercise, especially if in the end, instead of getting an affirmation like, well, you are indeed a great human being, what people would probably get is like, oh my God, in front of all these youngsters I've been made fool of and shown to be nothing. So note now that it's not a pointless exercise. He is not again trying to just make people look like fools. Sometimes students make a mistake thinking that this is all just, his way of having fun. The final goal of the dialectic is not entertainment. Socrates does believe that there is a point, and to know the truth is to possess logos. Remember the word logos? Logos is, of course, again, both word and reason. And this is what, in the end of it, we should find. And this is what gives us understanding of what the good is. So he believes it is possible. It can be achieved. We can actually get to the point when we get this logos. The final goal is to know the good. We all think what we do, essentially, don't we? Now, this is the key moment with Socrates. He thinks that if you truly know what the good is, you would not commit crimes and you would not do any of the immoral things. But people generally do know they know what the good is. However, he thinks that they are mistaken. And most of us, in fact, do kind of have this idea. Like, if I ask any one of you guys, do you know what is the good for you? You would say, yeah, I have a pretty good idea. I want a new car, for example, right? This is the good. I want the goods. Now note that it is indeed difficult to make something higher as the goal, because again, people would generally agree, yeah, there are some higher goals, but they are somewhere out there. How do I even achieve that? The car, on the other hand, is very tangible. I can put it in a garage and I will enjoy it, and I know that much. So many people are, in Socrates' mind, confused about that, because they pursue these things mistakenly thinking they are the good. Just because they are more approachable. They are easier to understand. They are easier to relate to. New iPhone, that's the good. I mean, I know what I can do with the new iPhone, right? I can show it to my friends, and they will think I'm so cool. And I can, do all the cool stuff with it. But the good, I mean, what the hell is the abstract good? What good is this going to do to me? Is there even such thing as the abstract good? So next week we will do this reading from Plato, which is, like I said, will be this whole dialogue describing him in great detail and showing how Socrates did this kind of dialogues. But okay, for now, what do you think the good is? Do you agree with Socrates that there is some sort of a good, or you think the good is indeed more tangible and it is? Let's take another poll on that. What the hell? Okay, so yes, there is a good. No, there is no good. In terms of like some sort of abstract good, not the car in front of you, but something abstract. That's interesting. Okay, I guess it's enough for now. So the result is like this: 17 people think there is a good. One person actually doesn't. One person thinks there is no good. I don't know who voted how. It doesn't matter. But like, yeah, that's an interesting kind of social experiment to ask. Yeah, well, I mean, in reality, most of us may agree that there is some abstract good, but it's kind of difficult for us to, again, put a finger in it, right? We live our lives day to day, and on a daily basis, things like cars and new iPhone are a lot more tangible, and we pursue them just because, it's clearly an easier little things to pursue. Whereas this abstract good, well, who knows what it is. We'll talk about it throughout the class, and hopefully, like I said, in the end we will get somewhat of a better idea, or not, but hopefully we will. So, any last thoughts before we finish? Anybody wants to say anything? What are your thoughts about Socrates in general? Do you like Socrates?
I do. His level of just not giving one heck is just astounding. He became a philosopher just because he wanted to prove someone wrong, and then he didn't prove them wrong.
He's an interesting figure. By the way, a few more pieces of information is he did take part in the war. He was fighting at some point, and he was also elected to some office at some point. So he wasn't always just wandering the streets. He wasn't a bum, at least at the beginning. And then he had a wife and a child, or even more than one child. I'm not sure how many children, but he definitely had a family, and so on. So sometimes you may wonder that he is just like this bum who was doing nothing but wandering the streets. No, he actually was a family man, and he had a good reputation overall throughout his life. It's just that this, in the end, when he started wandering the streets and bugging people, that was obviously robbing a lot of people the wrong way. And especially the fact that youth was following. So note that that's one of the reasons why they accused him of corrupting the youth. Because the youth, many of these youngsters, including Plato, were following him and learning things from him. And their parents were not very happy about the whole thing. Not only were they not happy that he was questioning them, but they were also not happy that the youth was looking at him and getting these ideas. And instead of becoming politicians or getting some sort of other occupations, they were doing philosophy. And what the hell is that? They gonna wander the streets barefoot like he did? We don't want that for our children. That sounds stupid.
I have one question
sure.
about him. Did he have any friends?
Oh yes, he had friends. Well, his students were his friends, first of all.
Oh,
and many of the dialogues talk about him participating in events and so on. So, no, yeah, of course, he had friends who mostly were his followers. And of course, Plato is one of the... So all these people, all his students who were crying when he was taking poison, for example. And by the way, several of them became well-known philosophers too. There are several schools, Cyrenaics and so on, who we know kind of sprang from some of his students. It's not just Plato. Plato is probably the most famous one because he wrote the most and he had the most sophisticated system. And we will talk about him next time, but he's not the only one. And again, many of them were from wealthy families, including Plato, and influential families in Athens. So he had good friends and he had good enemies, so to say, powerful enemies. In the end of the day, like I said again, he could have escaped. He had this option, and many people would probably be happy about him escaping rather than, but he wanted to make the point, and he makes the point in the reading, if you did it, that I am not going anywhere. I will continue bugging you. The only way for you to escape is to kill me. And so they did. So essentially that's like, oh, if you put it this way, I guess we don't have any choice. You annoyed us so much that, well, we're gonna kill you. Alright. So we are kind of running out of time now. Hopefully it was interesting for you guys. I'll put the video online again if you want to rewatch it and remove some of the periods of silence and so on. And yeah, thank you too. We will come back to it. Please do the next reading. I'll put it up right now probably and we will discuss it next time. Again, there will be some extra credit. It's kind of lengthy but interesting. So do your best, and again, I'll ask questions about it, and we'll discuss it next time.
Okay, alright.
Okay?
Спасибо. Okay, до свидания.
Спасибо, до свидания. Надеюсь, что вам понравилось. Hope you enjoyed it.